Marty Bent, Great American Mining.
Thank you for joining the program here today. I wanted to talk a little bit about some Bitcoin and natural gas and just the evolution of the new digital currency, if you wouldn't mind. So anytime we talked about cryptocurrency, Bitcoin, smart contracts, that sort of thing, I'd like to just kind of get a reset, if you will. And Marty, could you give us just a quick overview of Bitcoin and that technology, how that works for the listeners out there?
Yeah, so Bitcoin is a distributed peer-to-peer cash system, and it operates on a decentralized basis. So individual users run nodes, individual miners run miners, and the cooperation of the nodes, the miners, the developers, and everybody who's a stakeholder in the system sort of helps the system subsist. So the way Bitcoin works technically is blocks are produced on average every 10 minutes. That's the target for block production. And the way that happens is miners look to solve what's called a cryptographic hash function. So they are racing to find a hash below the current difficulty target within the network. And the miner that finds that hash is allowed to construct a block of transactions that gets added to the blockchain. And once the block's constructed, it sends a message to the rest of the network like, hey, I found this hash. I put these transactions in a block. If they're within the rules, the nodes sort of check the rules of the message sent by the miner. And if it's up to snuff, they add the block to the blockchain. The miner gets the block reward, which is the combination of the subsidy at any given point in time and the fees within the block. And miners go race to build another block. And the importance of a network working in this way is that it's not controlled by any centralized authority. There's no way to sort of dictate what happens in the network without the consensus of all the nodes in the network. So it is very hard to co-opt. It is very hard to confiscate. It is very hard to attack. And it produces a sovereign digital money that can't be controlled by governments or central banks.
So I want to ask you about that point right there in just a moment, though, which is the transparency behind Bitcoin and money, how that seems to be probably one of the biggest obstacles right now. At least in my opinion, it seems like just the whole, I guess, the transition of control and transition and authority almost seems to be bigger than the education block. And I'll ask you that in just a second. But I've never heard the term hash before. HASH, like hash browns, hash. In Bitcoin, I just got back from Colorado. They got a whole different definition for the word hash. What's your definition for hash in Bitcoin? I've never heard that before.
So a hash is a very it's a cryptographic term. So when you're solving a hash function, Bitcoin has a specific function that makes it work. It's called the hash cache SHA-256 hash function.
Okay.
And basically what it is just a huge math problem, and it has inputs, and the output is a hash, which is a long string of numbers and letters, or just numbers, I believe, for Bitcoin specifically. I'm not exactly sure on my feet right now.
It gets a little technical even for you. Got it. Okay, it's a collection. I got it. It's like a group, a collection, or whatever, a consortium, or whatever the word was you used.
It's a long string of numbers.
Thank you.
Very long numbers with a lot of zeros in front. And so in Bitcoin, the hash, there's a difficulty target at any given point in time. And that's what miners are trying to find a hash below the target. And so they run this SHA-256 hash function. They're running it millions and millions and millions of times every second, and just to produce these random numbers. So it's basically random number generation.
Okay. So I wanted to ask you about the education and the transparency obstacles. I understand they both are, so it's not a matter of which one is more, of an obstacle than the other. But in my opinion, I think that the transparency and the transition of authority and power is an obstacle for Bitcoin. And I also think, obviously, the education, because it's technology. Talk to me a little bit about those two obstacles and how that is being combated, if you wouldn't mind.
So in this regard, transparency may not be the best word to use. The best way to think about Bitcoin is as a digital bearer asset, similar to gold in the physical world.
Okay.
So like gold's a bearer asset, you can hold it, and final settlement is when, if you're doing it with the physical gold, is when you hand it over to the person you're transacting with. Similarly with Bitcoin, it is a push system, which is not like our current financial system of credit cards and debit cards and ACH, where it's a pull system. You can put your credit card information on the internet, and companies that you interact with can just pull money from your bank account, from your credit card account, without your permit. Well, they get your permission when you put it up there, but they can just do it automatically. Bitcoin, since it's a digital bearer asset, which means that you actually hold the keys that allow you to move the Bitcoin around the network, that's not the case. So it comes with different responsibilities and different sort of user experiences. So when you're sending Bitcoin, you have to sign a private key that says, "Hey, I own this Bitcoin on this part of the ledger. I'm looking to move it here," and it's you push it out to the network. It can't be pulled from you. So this is actually pretty revolutionary, where you have countries like China, Venezuela, Iran, where people have had money confiscated from them, and just they wake up one day and their bank account, the value of their bank account has just been cut automatically. Where with Bitcoin, that doesn't happen if you secure it properly and hold your own keys. Nobody's going to be able to pull that away from you. You have to push it out to the network.
So one of the reasons why we wanted to bring you on today is not only to talk about Bitcoin, just to do a little brief education part of it, but it is something that is transitioning into oil and gas. I've been following it now for, I don't know, at least 5 years, doing, I don't know, maybe quarterly or a few times a year type of interviews. But after what's happened over the past, say, 6 months to, I would say, 8 months, because really this did start last year before the American COVID-19 shutdown. This was already in the works last year. I see this speeding up very quickly. And when I saw the headline that China was looking at doing some integration of this sort of technology into the oil and gas sector, I thought, okay, well, we better start doing a lot more than quarterly, because, I'm not talking daily. You do the daily with your blogs and your interviews and posts and that sort of thing. And that's why we appreciate you coming on here today. But talk to me about the integration of this into the oil and gas world, and then we'll get into the natural gas side.
Yeah, so Bitcoin miners are in a race globally to find the lowest cost energy. It's a big part of their overall cost. And so if they want to mine profitably, they have to secure energy at the lowest cost possible. And to date, we found CoinShares as a company in the UK. They've done some research on this. Around 73% of energy that has been used to mine Bitcoin has been renewable energy, and that's stranded renewables specifically. So you have hydroelectric dams that are not being used or utilized, wind, solar is being underutilized, geothermal, all in sort of very desolate places on the planet. They sit there and nobody utilizes their energy. So Bitcoin miners show up, and that's very low cost energy, which helps them become more profitable. And so in the renewable sector, it's driven a lot of innovation, actually, because you have Bitcoin miners showing up where nobody wants to consume this energy and actually consuming it and playing around with ways to harness it and innovate around there. And then on top of that, in the oil and gas sector, we're finding that Bitcoin mining can help consume stranded gas and waste gas specifically. So it's helping fix some problems in the oil and gas industry in regards to emissions and wasted gas specifically. So because, again, miners are on that race to find the lowest cost energy. And it just so happens that wasted gas that would otherwise be flared, vented, is if you're just going to flare or vent it, you might as well plug some miners in and get some value out of that.
Let's talk about one of the most important things going on right now in the world of oil and gas, which is finding capital, which is accessing capital. Last year, there were a lot of oil and gas companies that got hit. They went to banks. The banks said, we can't secure that because it's oil and gas now. There was this movement last year due to the climate change movement to not have banks secure oil and gas holdings, and of course it creeped into the Arctic and some other areas. My understanding is Bitcoin can actually be a solution to these problems, some of the political things that are going on in the banking industries. Is that true?
I mean, Bitcoin's permissionless nature certainly allows that. If somebody were willing to take the risk to fund their operations via Bitcoin, there's nobody to stop you from accepting Bitcoin as a currency. There's no ACH or Swift system that will stop that transaction if you're willing to take that risk to use Bitcoin to build out your operations. And then on top of that, I think Bitcoin, if we're coming from it from a appease the regulators angle, if we're able to prove out that and build out Bitcoin mines on oil and gas production sites that help us waste less energy and flare less energy and pollute the environment less, can certainly help the argument with regulators.
Well, that's how I kind of looked at it when I started seeing that, last year, the movement of the banks were to not back and finance some of these oil and gas operations. And I saw some of the movement of the cryptocurrency, Bitcoin, smart contracts, if you will, hashing now. I guess hash is the new word that I learned today. When I start seeing those things pop up in the headlines, and then I, see China and the energy industry and everything, I thought, this might actually be a workaround to some of these geopolitical politics in the world of banking, because Bitcoin, like you said, it's not discriminatory by nature. It's just ones and zeros. I guess it's ones, they're not discriminatory against each other. I guess they work with each other. Well, I guess how deep we want to get into the matrix is a different story, but because the ones and the zeros didn't get along in there. Go ahead. I mean, just elaborate a little bit for people on how this actually bypasses some of that things in the energy industry. I know you just did, but I guess I'm just looking at it as this seems to be the next step.
Well, yeah. So outside of the energy industry, we saw a great example of it this week. Obviously, Iran and Venezuela are two countries that have been sanctioned by the United States government, and it is very hard for them to move money through the digital financial system to the traditional financial system between each other. So Venezuela owed Iran some money because they helped them fix their refineries in Caracas and around Caracas, I believe. And the only way that they could pay them was to get 9 jets, fill them with gold, and literally fly gold to Iran to pay them for fixing their refineries. So that's an insane amount of cost, an insane amount of energy just to actually move the gold and make this transaction, where if you were to do this with Bitcoin, which some people suspect that countries like Venezuela and Iran have done before, and Russia, you don't have to get 9 huge jets, fill them with gold, and take all that time and money to actually move it. You can construct a transaction and send it to through the peer-to-peer network, and that won't be stopped by anybody. And so you can do that for a lot cheaper than moving all that gold.
My goodness, those must have been heavy planes. Gold is heavy. I mean, it's a lot heavier than you think. A brick of gold. Holy smokes!
And when you compare Bitcoin to gold, that's one of gold's biggest drawbacks when you're comparing it to Bitcoin, is its physical nature. It's a lot easier to confiscate gold, and we've seen that throughout history. We had Executive Order 6102 here in the United States in May of 1932, I believe, where the government basically forced everybody to either hand in their gold or forcibly took it out of their hands, and then increased the price right after they did that. And if you weren't burying it in your backyard or didn't have it in a secret vault that was well hidden, you were screwed. Or Bitcoin, you can keep your digital gold 12. It can be 12 words in your head. If you can memorize it, you can have these words in your head, and that's how you access your Bitcoin. And they can't confiscate that unless they torture you.
How about the recent rounds of stimuluses and that sort of thing? I would have guessed that pumping this much money into the economy would really do quite positive things. At least the momentum would be positive for Bitcoin, at least in my head, from a layman's point of view. I don't know. I'm asking you because you're the expert. But Does the recent, $40 trillion they pumped into the economy or whatever they did in the last month, how does that affect Bitcoin?
Yeah, that's the going thesis for Bitcoin, is that it very much helps drive attention and adoption of Bitcoin, because you have two competing monetary systems now in the world, which hadn't really existed because gold had been completely neutered by governments. So you have these two experiments playing out in the wild. The one run by central bankers and governments around the world, where it's just print. We can print our way out of this. And as they're doing that, they're inflating the monetary base and debasing individuals' purchasing power the world over. Bitcoin is the complete opposite of that, where it is a 21 million unit supply cap that cannot be debased, and it's going to be extremely hard, if not impossible, to convince the members of the network to increase that supply cap. So as central banks are debasing and printing and deteriorating purchasing power of their currencies, Bitcoin is an alternative where you can store your value and your time in this digital currency that is not going to do that. If you buy one Bitcoin, you know that you're going to have 1 out of 21 million Bitcoin into perpetuity.
Marty Bent with us, Great American Mining. My understanding is you've got some daily activities and other media that you do. Go ahead and give yourself a plug, how people can find your information on the. It's not hard to find on the web. You're one of the premier Bitcoin people out there. So I've pulled up your Marty's Bent, and I've seen it on so many different news sites that I imagine you're all over the world. So talk to how people can kind of find. It wasn't hard for me to find you. So, but I'm sure you got a centralized area.
Yeah, I hang out a lot on Twitter at Marty Bent. And then I have a website where all my content is. It's tftc.io. And I run a podcast called Tales from the Crypt, a Bitcoin podcast, where I interview people in the space and throughout the macroeconomic space to sort of help educate people about Bitcoin and why it's important in the digital age. Because, Jason, really seriously, we're at a very pivotal part in human history where we can have the Chinese, the Communist Party surveillance state exported to the rest of the world, where your every transaction, your every movement is tracked by a central authority, and they can use that against you, stop you from conducting economic activity from a centralized location. Or we can go down the path of building out distributed systems like Bitcoin, where you can't be censored. It comes with a little bit more responsibility and a little bit more work, but I think as we move into the digital age, we either get digital serfdom or digital freedom, and Bitcoin provides that digital freedom.